The invisible self. The outside world is a visible reflection of the invisible processes that defines a being. What defines a being comes from the invisible side of things, and what a being ultimately seeks is the one who is doing the definitions. It is only when the being will focus its attention upon the invisible within itself that the being will nourish the one who is doing the definitions. Otherwise, the being only nourishes the definitions themselves, and thus gets caught up into their temporal states rather than remaining one with its natural and eternal state as that which remains forever invisible. To nourish the invisible side of ourselves is to nourish the eternal side of ourselves, for the invisible side is always present wherever and whenever we are. When we nourish the visible side of ourselves, we feed that which is temporal, not eternal. To do so constantly within a repeating pattern generates mental vortices which sucks the attention of the being within temporal manifestations of itself, thereby placing the attention of the being upon that which will forever remain unstable. Those temporal manifestations are manifestations in the visible domain of the constant interactions that exist between the visible and the invisible in the macro and micro perspectives of the universe. Those interactions generates movement which is a direct manifestation of change, for nothing visible can remain the same forever, the visible being forever modified by the invisible. The same relationship is true in the human side of things as well. For it is true that for a human being, the constant interactions between the visible and the invisible domains generates the movement which is responsible for the experience of life itself. The constant cycle going from one state, invisible, to the other, visible, and back into the one state, invisible, again, repeat ad infinitum, will generate the movement that is responsible for the vibrations of light energy itself. For the goal of light energy is to return to its invisible state, to which it does cyclically at the rate of the Planck unit of time, or at the smallest possible unit of time. At each time it returns to its invisible state, light energy releases the light energy that it carried while on the visible state, into the invisible domain. Through the release of that light energy within the invisible domain, that light energy instantly disappears from our 3D space-time continuum and enters the realm of the invisible continuum, so as to pick the information found within that realm and bring it back to the visible continuum. Within the invisible realm, the light energy gets impregnated with whatever information that is to be found at that specific moment within it. The light energy returns to the visible domain after the smallest possible unit of time possible, known as a Planck time, fully charged with what it has brought back from the invisible domain. The light energy releases that charge instantly within the visible domain, thus releasing the total expressions of the total impressions it has brought back from the invisible domain. The invisible domain imprints the light energy with content or information that will be released within the visible domain at the next Planck unit of time, or at the next flash of light energy within the visible domain. Each time the light energy flashes its contents or informations coming from the invisible domain within the visible sense domain, the visible domain is updated. After this moment, the light energy returns back into the invisible domain in order to generate the next generation or iteration of the visible domain for the being to experience. This process is never ending, but to resume, the visible domain is a space where the imprints received from the invisible domain carried within light energy are released, while the invisible domain is the space where the packets of light energy are imprinted and charged by the contents or informations found within the invisible domain. The visible is made true when we perceive ourselves through the senses. which doesn't specifically equate to our sight. Our senses gives us specific information about specific wavelengths of the light energy. Those specific wavelengths of the light energy give specific information to those specific areas of the brain which can detect those specific wavelengths of the light energy. For some areas of the brain, those differentiated wavelengths are detected as sight. For others, they are detected as sound, as smell, as taste, or as touch. The common denominator within them all is that they are all different interpretations of the same light energy, a light energy which exists forever in a constant relationship with the invisible. It is at the moment where the invisible meets the visible side of things that the present is made true. The now is the constant manifestation of this process throughout eternity. It is only in the now that the invisible side of things comes into direct contact with the visible side of things, for it is only in the forever changing now that the invisible is made true. What a being seeks is to reunite itself with the invisible side of things, for the eternal being exists within the invisible side of things, not the visible. This is demonstrated through the simple fact that the one who is doing the thinking remains forever invisible, the visible being only temporal manifestations of the invisible being. The invisible, in and as itself, can never be demonstrated, for as soon as it is, its essence changes into something new. Every new other things will forever come and replace every demonstrations of the invisible as a thing, thus rendering every demonstrations of the invisible as a thing to be forever false witnesses of the invisible as no thing. The only true witness of the invisible is the invisible itself in action, and that invisible is the subjective side of a being. To seek ourselves into the visible is to seek the source of ourselves within what we are not. We are not the visible, for the visible is a temporal manifestation of the intemporal being that we seek, and is thus not the being that we are. That being is the eternal being of which we are truly and forever one with. We are forever one with it, for we are forever one with the invisible side of things. For we are the invisible being which forever processes the visible into something new. The being that we seek exists as the invisible side of a being, and the invisible side exists as the inner subjectivity of a being. However, the paradox is that the invisible side of a being is and cannot be limited or expressed through words for what it truly is, and therefore cannot truly be expressed through words. For as soon as it is, it loses its attribute of invisibility. Thus, it loses its true nature or meaning as it is expressed. A word or a series of words can only point into the direction where the invisible exists within a being, but can never portray what the invisible is in and of itself. We process the visible through us constantly changing it within the invisible side of ourselves, for it is within our invisible side that the processes of evolution or the processes of change through transformations occurs. These transformations are absolutely necessary, for the invisible is absolutely necessary, and for the invisible to be forever true, change has to be forever true. If change was somewhere somewhat not true, then it wouldn't even be possible to entertain any ideas upon existence. We wouldn't exist. The only way for this absolute necessity to be true is for the visible to change constantly through a process of evolution or equilateral additions that operates in the visible and invisible side of things. Everything changes constantly, but only at different rates. The invisible is a space within a being where the visible transforms itself into something new. It is the invisible space where the invisible creator as ourselves modified the visible universe by transforming it so as to change, evolve, and create the ever-changing visible universe that we experience. To try to put it more bluntly, the invisible that is referred to here is the aspect of a being which remains forever invisible to the being itself. It is the part of a being which is forever observant of the being in its many manifestations, yet never to be observed. It is the part of a being that is never able to be seized, for it is the observer who forever observes that which the being expresses and receives. It is the inner realm from within which a being is placed and observes reality. It is the mental bubble that shields the sense of self from anything which surrounds it. In other words, it simply is the domain from within which the presence of a being operates. A domain which can never be fully seen or fully realized. As an example, I, on one hand, cannot fully express all that I am within myself to any observer who observes the words that are being presented of me here. For whatever I am in full cannot be completely expressed through the limiting constructs of the words that I choose. For who I am truly is unlimited, and the unlimited cannot, in any circumstances whatsoever, be limited to a construct which is limited within and as itself. A construct such as a word. What I am and what I try to express of my being here is the observer who will forever be found within the stance of the observer, and not the stance of the actor. Hence, whatever is seen of my expression here is related to the actor aspect of my being, for the observer, you, who observes the words that I express. This is so simply because of the fact that my expression is observed through the words that I express or act out, whereas the observer can only be inferred within those words and not actually expressed as those words. Those words are the expressions of the observer acting itself out. Thus they are the actions of the observer and not the observer itself. The words that I express here are not to be identified with the actor figure, for it is not the actor that I am trying to convey, but the observer who remains forever invisible behind the actions of the actor. The observer is the permanent aspect of ourselves, as it will forever be a witness to all that will happen to ourselves, as well as to all that we will create and destroy. It is the invisible part of ourselves that remains forever permanent as the source and recipient of all of our experiences. It is the unchangeable, unmoved, and forever observant aspect of ourselves which forever processes the informations that the senses brings back to its awareness. It is invisible, for otherwise it would stop being what it is, which is the observer, or the universe itself, experimenting itself through each and every one of us, yet never to be contained within any one of its expressions. The invisible is only such for our limited perspective of reality, for whatever is now seen as being invisible is in fact full of information, just as the invisible observer is full of information from the perspective of the one doing the observations. For example, I, as the observer of these words, am full of information, related or not to the subject at hand, either it being the information of what I did yesterday, or the information of what I learned when I was in college, even if I, as the observer, remains forever invisible. It is not because something is invisible that it lacks information or content, for even the notion of invisibility itself contains a complete set of information that seeks to be discovered. That which is invisible contains information that is seeking to be known, just as the observer seeks to know itself through the information that it contains. In simpler terms, the invisible self here is the self which is simply forever present, just as the forever present self which is currently present within you, as you read these words. That self which is currently present within you is that same self that I am talking about here, and not the self that you perceive yourself to be from within the self-limiting constraints or constructs or prisons of your thoughts. For you see, those selves, or thoughts, are created out of the temporal visions of self that you have constructed as parts of yourself within your minds. Yet, the true self is never to be found within them, for they are its temporal manifestations, not its intemporal and all-permeating one. The true self that is sought is intemporal in nature, thus it can only be found within the intemporal in itself. The intemporal is that part of yourself which is forever invisible, for it is only the invisible self that has the ability to permeate all parts of existence. If that self were to be visible, it wouldn't be able to permeate all of existence, or all moments of time, for it would be limited to the visions or memories it had of itself. Whatever the self is truly is not a vision whatsoever, for it is that part of self which is forever present throughout all images or moments or visions or memories that are reflected back to self in the now moment. For it is the only part of self which is never attached to any of those passing moments. Being forever present as your true self, such as the one who is reading these words at this very moment, the self that I am suggesting, whether you are thinking about it or not, is forever present as your true self, and that forever present self can only be so through complete invisibility, such as the invisible self that is to be found within you as you read these words. Whether you want to or not, there is no escaping that invisible self, for it is the forever part of you. It is the part which never separates from you, for it being forever present, such as the present self that you are at this particular moment in time, and this one, and this one, and the next one after this one, ad infinitum. Even when the last images of self will have disappeared, the invisible or present self will still be present. The invisible or present self will remain. There is no escaping the invisible self, since nothing can become it. Nothing can become the invisible self. And you cannot escape that which hasn't yet begun to become something. For such a thing is simply non-existent to begin with. It can never become something, thus it can never end, for it has never even begun being something. What has an ending must have a beginning, since the invisible self has no beginning, for if it had, it wouldn't be invisible. Then it implies that it has no end as well, being thus the eternal and intemporal you, which forever experiences your reality as you go along in all and every now moments that you experience. Since nothing can become the invisible self, and by nothing I mean absolutely everything that the mind can conceive of in place of that nothing, and since the invisible self is now true, it is in fact true that you have now an invisible self within you, which is the invisible self who is narrating these words in your invisible mind at this invisible moment within you. It thus means that the only thing which is true across all times and epochs is the invisible self. For the invisible self is forever true if it is now true. The visible self is now forever false, because of being the forever dead past image of now, relative to what the now is at this particular moment in time, as experienced by the invisible self. While the invisible self is now forever true, because of being the forever alive, present expressions of now, in all of the now experienced by the invisible self. The invisible self is the only true part of self, for it permeates all times and epochs that is experienced by self. It is the only aspect about the now which is forever true in all manifestations of the now. The invisible self is forever true now, because the invisible self is always true for every now experienced by the invisible self.